Hello and welcome to the PSC In Conversation. I'm Eli Bond, an associate partner here at the PSC, the specialist consultancy dedicated to making public services brilliant. And we have a really exciting episode today. I am joined by senior partner and best-selling author, Dr Antonio Weiss, to talk about the second edition of his book, The Practical Guide to Digital Transformation. Antonio, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you, Eli. You know, I'm usually asking the question, so it's a rare privilege for me to be trying to, flounder and answer some.
We've got you on the other side of the table today.
I know.
So I think it's fair to say that this book is a bit of a cult classic at the PSC. Maister's Trusted Advisor, Barber's Instruction to Deliver, Weiss's Practical Guide to Digital Transformation. So I wanted to know what actually inspired the original and why 4 years later is now the right moment to do a second edition.
Gosh, well, thank you for the cult classic label. I will gladly take that. I hadn't heard that before, but I'll make sure it continues. Actually, with all the books that I've tried to write, this was the fourth, there's now been five, I felt, and I always feel, that there's lots of great, particularly business books targeted at managers or leaders, which are either like great but quite framey, high level, like Leadership Matters or Get the Burning Platform Right, and that's not to be disparaging about those books, but they're quite like useful with one big idea, but that's the one big idea, or they're like really granular and specific, like we just saw a study which showed that people like jam jars if they're positioned in a certain way. What does that mean for business? And all of those things are great, but there's not that much, at least in my view, which goes in the big space in the middle, which is, yes, the high level and the specific, but practically, what do you do next? You know, what do you ask in the next meeting? What work should you commission? How could you prioritize some initiatives in the digital space? So the book, when I started writing, I guess 2021, and then came out in 2022, was trying to answer the question, in the world of hype-heavy digital transformation, where it's slightly bewildering and dizzying if you're a manager or a leader, how do you cut through that and then work out, what should I be really worrying about? What actions should me and my team be taking? And how should we be thinking about the horizon? So I was trying to work and exist in that space. And then why 4 years later is it still good to update? All change inevitably has changes over time, and 4 years is a very long time in technology. So there's been a couple of paradigm shifts. I mean, I remember writing in the first edition that AI, I think I said, will continue to disappoint. Which in hindsight doesn't look that clever, but I wasn't really tracking the transformer architectures models, which is what gave birth to ChatGPT-2 and obviously changed everything in late 2022. So it needed an update for the AI age, which I've written about elsewhere, but I think deserves to be in there. And I'm pretty confident that quantum and use cases of quantum will be the next big thing which boards are asking. So it needed something on that as well. And also all of these case studies that are in the book, you get more data on them as time emerges, so they need a bit of a refresh. And what might have looked a great idea after 2 years in 2022 may no longer look such a clever idea after 6 years or so.
That really makes complete sense. And I think what I've always noticed about the way that I use the book is it really does feel a bit like almost like a sort of friend you can draw on, because it takes you through that practical end-to-end journey, and you can dip into a very particular point of the process that you're in and say, oh, I need some help, or, what do I need to do? And I think that's really interesting to position it as differently from those either sort of macro or more micro perspectives that perhaps we see more often. So I was interested in whether you feel that the failure rate around digital transformation has changed at all in sort of the 4 years since the first edition of the book. I think sort of some studies put the failure rate as high as even sort of 70% of digital transformations don't achieve the outcomes that they're looking for. And so given that digital is still not feeling like perhaps the silver bullet that was promised, why is the risk of undertaking digital transformation still so high?
Well, I would say probably at least start with 2 points. One is that I don't think it's got any better. So, those odds of digital transformation success rates, and that means has this change program initiative, implement a new CRM, transition to a new platform, move more services online, have they met their objectives? That failure rate is, as you say, between 70 and 80 and maybe even 80+%. And I don't see any evidence to suggest that that's materially improved. And in fact, there's a lot of data somewhat emerging around AI, which says it may even be worse with AI. So I think there's a very unhelpful study, which was sort of from MIT, which came out and became very popular last year, which said, 95% of generative AI pilots are failing to deliver on their benefits. And everyone, well, not everyone, but lots of people cottoned onto that. The reason why I think it's not that helpful is because the methodology is not brilliant. But the overall sentiment, I think, remains true. Now, why is that the case? Well, as you know from your world of transformation and change and strategy and getting people to do different things, all change is hard. And in fact, the failure rate of transformation per se is 70, 80% anyway. And I don't think there's anything materially different about digital change versus people-centered change. It is all change. And then that begs the question, well, what is it about change and transformation which is uniquely challenging? And maybe we can get into that. But there are certain factors which is very clear from our experience at the PSC and our clients' experiences, but also the long canon of research into this, that there are certain things that you need to do in order to beat the odds of failure. And they're really hard to do. And lots of the time people struggle with that, which is why we're here to help.
Absolutely. And I think that point around people underestimating the failure rate of transformation in general and of change in principle is a really important one. And actually, it reminds me of, I think you open part 2 of the book with the Mike Tyson quote, "Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth," which I really enjoy. But I guess sort of getting into that point, what do you think are some of the things that do continually knock digital programs off course? And how do you optimize for success within a digital context?
I think in the book I summarize a few main themes, and I draw out 3, maybe in ascending order of importance. So the first is that there's just inevitably not inevitably with change, but often with change, it's siloed. So it is too focused within a singular department, whereas the change, in order to be truly useful, should be across departments or organizational structures. And this gets to the point about, true good process redesign should be end to end rather than within an individual constraint. And too often change, for lots of reasons, is just focused on a small area. So those silos mean that it never really delivers the benefits that it could do and should do. The second reason is around benefits and expectations of benefits. So one of the worst, well, not worst, but most challenging and repeated issues is that people always overstate the benefits because we have optimism bias, because as humans, we're hopefully innately optimistic. And also because there's a bit of a racket whereby consultancies, not the PSC, will often sell a business case promising the earth, and they're not around to deliver the change. So therefore they can say, well, there's going to be an enormous benefit to be delivered. It's, you just got to sign off this project, commission the big program, but everyone will have forgotten about that later on. And if you're not clear about what outcomes you're going to get and realistic about by when, then inevitably when you go back and evaluate, you will have failed to have met them. So it's almost like you're setting yourself up to fail. But the primary reason, the third reason, which I'll mention, is something which I hope runs through the book and what we say at the PSC. And I know you did an excellent podcast with Juliana kind of talking about the human side of transformation, which is utterly essential. And I would say it's the human plus the technology as well. And people still, you still hear leaders say, the change is going to be enormous. It's going to be transformational. I don't need to understand what the technology does or how it works or what impact it will have because I don't need to. That's the CTO's job. That's the CIO's job. And I think that's the most dangerous bit. People don't realize that in order for technology change to be successful, it has to be across an organization. It can't just be the CIO's problem.
That rings so true to me. And it makes me think of actually Brené Brown, in her recent Rising Strong book, was talking about how transformation is inherently about breaking stuff and removing things. And our psychology hates that. We hate breaking things. We hate sort of scaling down or removing things that we've had before. And actually, we find it much more comfortable to say, oh, well, we'll just add on and we'll just build and we'll just make more. And I almost thought that analogy is almost never more true than in digital, where you've got legacy systems and the temptation to just add another module, add another bit, increase the complexity is kind of so tempting. And I wonder, dare I say, if that sort of leads us quite nicely into my next question, talking about legacy systems and perhaps sort of complicated structures. Obviously, for us, our kind of primary focus is all about public services and the transformation that they're going through. Do you see there being distinctive challenges about what digital transformation and success of those programs looks like within a public services context?
Definitely. And I think, speaking in a personal capacity, let's say, it really irks me when people take the mindset, oh, we can just be like John Lewis, or we can just be like AN financial services company or any other energy company, and translate that into public services, because there's something uniquely different and distinct about public services. The most important difference is that it is, it's written into their very nature. They are universal. They are for everybody. And that doesn't mean that you can't have a slightly differentiated type of provision. In fact, maybe you should do, but because you have to make it for everyone, that brings new complexity. So, the classic easy example is that if you are a financial services institution, you literally choose your customer base. You could choose a digital native base. If you are Metro Bank, you can choose a customer base that prefers, the in-person high street experience. But you can make those choices. You can't make those choices in public services. You can choose how best to serve people, and you need to work out how to do that. But it's for everyone, which means, yes, there can be a digital provision, but there will inevitably be a digital plus improved accessibility requirements, plus maybe for those, service accessibility for those who don't have a digital preference. And that adds cost and complexity, but it's the right and the only thing that you can do. So that's one big change. The other is that the vast majority of our public services, and this is true of almost every country that delivers public services, are older institutions. There's very few completely new. I mean, the NHS is setting up NHS Online, which is very exciting. It's something we're tracking very closely and keen to support with. But most institutions have legacy ways of working, systems, contracts, processes, and anything new needs to accept and integrate with that. And you can't just always start from scratch on a greenfield site and run 100 miles an hour, because you need to bring the existing with you. And that is a big change as well. And the third big change, or third big difference, I would say, in public services is you are accountable to the public, and the transparency and the spotlight that comes with that is rightly enormous. But it does mean, I feel, that everyone has, you often hear the sentiment, public services can't innovate, or public services are especially poor at transformation. That is not what the evidence says. The private sector is just as bad or just as good, struggles just as much, but the lens and the microscopic focus on those failures is much more acute in public services, and that creates a different risk calculus, which is really hard for leaders to navigate.
This is so interesting. I almost want us to just pause on this for a moment, because I feel like this is a really critical insight to understanding the complexity. So I think what I've heard is that whilst it may look like other organizations with their digital products or sort of digital technologies are trying to appeal to everybody, actually, when that advert hits your Instagram or when that product comes across your Google search, it is targeted to you, and it is targeted to a very, actually, relatively small audience of people that product or service is designed for. Whereas I think what we're saying is that for public services, we don't have that luxury. Every digital ecosystem that we want, whether it's kind of patients, users, the public to interact with, has to attempt to be optimized for everyone, which almost goes against what most businesses would hone for in terms of how they would cohort, how they would segment, how they would attract their customer base. So already you're starting from a far, far more complex end user ask. And so when you then add into that the complexity of sort of the infrastructure that they're working in and the accountability that sits on top sort of to society, that's kind of the extra complexity that is present for digital and public services that's not present elsewhere.
Absolutely. And so, a good manifestation of that is gov.uk. So, we've had the pleasure of working with the Government Digital Service over many years. Gov.uk is still held up as a beacon of successful digital transformation for all governments across the world. And that was the unification of hundreds and hundreds of distinct different websites with styles and approaches and language and design into one unified format. And we will often hear public service leaders or indeed politicians will say, I don't like it. It's ugly, it's boring, it's where's the personalization? Where are the moving images? Where's the video? And those may not be illegitimate kind of user preferences, but the point is, if you are designing something for everyone, it needs to be accessible, it needs to be clean, it needs to meet as many needs as you can possibly do in one go, and that will mean making design choices which aren't necessarily optimized for any single group, but they're trying to optimize for as many as possible. And that leads you in a very different product development way. It leads you into a different service approach. And it is something, special and wonderful about public services. At the PSC, when we practice public value design, one of the key tenets of that is appreciating that because this is for the public and it's seeking to deliver value for the most people possible, you make different choices.
I love that. I think that universality challenge is a really important one, and I think that will resonate with a lot of public service leaders listening to this. And I wonder then if, and it won't surprise you to hear where I'm going next, Antonio. I am really keen to get your insights into what then, with the complexity of both that stakeholder landscape and the end user landscape, the human side of transformation needs to look like to do this really well. And we've talked a bit about sort of what the end user needs, but actually in terms of leadership styles, cultural behaviors that organizations need to adopt, what do you think it really takes for these organizations to have that right human approach to digital transformation?
Great question. And I feel like it matters on the words, even human-centered, matter on many distinct levels. So I would say on the first, it is to ground everything in real humans benefiting from a change. And so the classic challenge we have at the moment is people are all going, AI solution, AI chatbot or AI agent. And that's new and exciting and may deliver value, but you need to point that new technology at a human problem. The human problem might be, I have a huge amount of friction navigating through the different social services that I receive, that I need in order to care for for someone in my family. Well, that's a real problem. Let's think about how an agentic approach could help that. Fine, that seems reasonable, but center it in a particular human's needs. And that involves user-centered thinking. It involves being very clear about who you're there for and what problems are you trying to solve for them. So that's the first one. The second human element that I would really stress is, maybe I'm stretching the point here, but I feel that too many leaders are still in the space of not understanding the technology side. So having the humility to say, I don't quite get it, but the curiosity to then work out what does that mean, so that yes, you're leading the charge and the transformation, but you have with all your perspectives, an appreciation of how the technology actually works. And for me, spoiler alert, there's a question that we sometimes ask our software developers in interviews, which is which they know the answer to, obviously. But if an exec can't answer the question, how does an Instagram post work technically? I think that's a red flag. because it means that there isn't an appreciation of the complexity of the data flows, the jurisdictions that things move across, the cyber risk which will emerge. And it needs the human to appreciate how it works in order to lead that well. So that's the second area. And the third is that human-centered leadership maybe links in the first one to being clear about how this is actually going to benefit a human. So obviously the first point is work out what the problem is that you're solving. The third one is make sure that you do actually solve it. So I feel like in change, a lot of the challenges are because the incentive structures are completely wrong. So I'm very struck, and it's not very popular at any moment, but there is a lot of evidence now that the 4-day working week approach, which had lots of evaluations, some of the councils in Cambridge who approached this, actually were able to deliver the same or equal outcomes for 20% less input. And it begs the question, well, if that worked, but most change transformations fail, why is that the case? And the best answer to that question at the moment is because on the 4-day working week, the benefits accrue to the people making the change happen. They get 20% more time to spend with their families or loved ones or on their own or enjoy their lives better. And the incentives are all perfectly aligned. And I think that one of the tricks, well, not tricks, but important things is for for leaders to work out how do we make the incentive structure work for humans in this change.
That's so interesting. So being able to answer that what's in it for me question being so critical to how and why this stuff works. And I loved what you were saying about the role of leaders' curiosity and willingness to learn being really central to this, because I think in lots of public services, but I'll pick the NHS as an example because it's the one I know best, we still see a lot of senior leaders saying, oh, well, that's okay because I've got my techie digi team over there and they're going to sort it out. And that just isn't good enough in terms of delivering the transformation that they all need to succeed. And what's really interesting, but also really hard about what comes next is we're asking those leaders to have the humility to say they don't know, to be willing to learn on top of what are already incredibly difficult and stressful portfolios of work where they have, a million requests coming in all the time. But they do need to be able to imagine and envision the future for their teams. And if they don't understand how the digital that they're trying to bring in can do that, I think you're absolutely right. They won't be able to sort of lead it with vigor. And it's striking to me at a moment where only just this week we've heard about how the overwhelming majority of ICBs have just lost their chief technology officers through the latest restructures. That ask, therefore, of that engagement with digital is going to fall across the rest of the C-suite. So there's never been a better invitation to say, what does it look like for you to step into that digital gap and really get interested in a new way?
But you're completely right to call out the empathy required for the challenge. Like it is really hard, and as you say, there's a challenge in having the humility to acknowledge where there may be gaps in knowledge, and then there's a challenge about do you have the capacity even to learn something new or find the time for it. And it's the job of advisors and support organizations, and hopefully we play an important role in this at the PSC to make that as easy and frictionless as possible. And I would say, the famous line, a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. Actually, I don't think that's true. I think a little knowledge for all of leaders delivering the change could be hugely powerful, because it brings everyone onto a slightly more, just gets everyone to a slightly more common level of understanding. Even something as relatively technologically unexciting as data interoperability, right? That will, let's say you want one system to talk to another, that will mean inevitably prioritizing time within two distinct teams to change data schema and data capture, and or creating a new initiative which will still require time from those teams in order to do that data mapping. And unless, like any good change initiative, unless there is understanding at the top for the importance of that and what the outcome that will lead to, well, of course, why would you prioritize that? But a little bit can go a really long way there. And hopefully things like the book can help with that, but also capability building, and just spending time with boards. Every board has an away day where they're learning about something new, be it cyber, AI, I would suggest that it would be a risky assumption to believe that everyone's already learned everything about digital transformation because there's a new interesting thing over here. So let's not be afraid to recap on some of the fundamentals.
And I think you touch on something so critical there, which is we need shared language to be able to do this together. And I feel like one of the parts that I enjoy most when I've worked on big digital transformation programs is that question of how do we build a narrative around this that makes sense to the clinician, to the manager, to the software engineer, to the design architect? How do all of these people feel like they are hearing the same story, know the value that they bring to it so that they can embark on it together? It's no good to start off in super high-tech technical languages where people feel like they're not included and not invited and it's not for them. At the same time, if we don't commit to learning that little bit together so that we can really understand what is the plumbing that's going into building this thing and what do we get at the end, then you won't get the engagement and the investment. So I think you're so right. How do you build that shared understanding and be brave enough to learn a little and to dip your toe in is a really nice invitation. So we're coming to the end of our time, Antonio, which is very sad. But I wonder if I could finish by asking you, what feels most different now as you look ahead, dare I say, to the next 20 of digital transformation in public services? And are there any particular hopes you have for what readers might take away from the Practical Guide to Digital Transformation this time around?
Oh gosh, well, thank you, Ellie, for the invitation. So on the on the next 20, what's coming up? I talk a bit about it in the sections on generative AI. I think there's a very helpful mental model, which is to think of ourselves, particularly with AI now, as being in the in-between times. Like anyone who can say they know where the benefits from AI are going to accrue, or indeed, hand on heart, they're 100% sure that they definitely are going to accrue, that nobody can be certain. And that is a tricky place, because how do you, as a senior leader, make bets as to where to invest time, capacity, and resources in order to make lives better for patients and for carers, and for their families and for your staff? That uncertainty requires an agility, which I think is more accentuated than ever before. And the main reason for that is because particularly generative AI is a very novel technology. So we talked a little bit earlier about transformer architectures, which I would suggest the thing that underpin the shift from narrow AI approaches through to this more creative generative model. That's less than 10 years old. It's very early doors to know exactly where that leads. And that presents challenges about how to approach change with flexibility and agility, but also ambition as well. But there are ways through that, and exactly as I say, being agile, being open to evaluating and pivoting where you need to go is the right way. The hope for what people will take away is at least threefold. So one is, like, it has to start with what's the value to a real human person at the end. Like, only use digital and data and technology to make things better. And then within that, you have to ask, like, and how much better are we making it? And is that improvement worth the costs and inevitably the risks that we will incur from a new change? And it's okay to be mature enough to say, it's only incrementally better. So there's no point in investing in a whole new enterprise system because it's just not worth it at the moment. So that's the first point, focus on the value. The second one is, yes, a lot of tech can seem bewildering. The difference between your AGI and your Gen AI and your agents and your agentic AI is deliberately confusing. But some of this stuff is very, very complicated. But humans are very clever, okay? It's not that complicated. And getting a grasp of some of the fundamentals will take you a long way. And I hope the book, but also the work that we do at the PSC really helps bring everyone to a more common understanding, as you say. And the third takeaway, I hope, is to be ambitious and hopeful for the future. We live through an extraordinary historical privilege of enormous technological and advancement and change. And it's up to us, it's up to every leader working in public services to make sure that that future is better for the generations to come. And it's down to us. And that's a great privilege. You know, it comes with some, obviously some challenges, but I'd much rather be in this position than not. So let's make the most of it.
That is a wonderful sentiment for us to finish on. Dr. Antonio Weiss, thank you so much for all of your insightful insights into your second edition of this wonderful book. And if you would like to get your hands on the second edition of the Practical Guide to Digital Transformation, you can pick up your own copy from all good book retailers. Or if you'd like to find out more about how us at the PSC can support you with your digital transformation journey, then please do get in touch. We will be back next week with the PSC In Conversation, focusing back on the next 20 and what it looks like to make public services brilliant for the next 20 years and beyond. We've been Eli Bond and Dr. Antonio Weiss. You're listening to the PSC In Conversation. Thank you so much for being with us.